And hello, everybody, and welcome to Presence. I am Doug King, and we are in episode number 4, I believe, on our study for cartography. We are studying the cartography of the world's largest religion, Christianity. And as we've said all along, if you're going to study this map of where Christianity is and how it's laid out on that map, you have to go back to the beginnings and the interpretations and the understandings that brought us to this place where we have ended up with a religion made of thousands of denominated, separated forms. And we are asking the question, is this as good as it gets, so to speak? And where do we go from here, proposing a future? So, we've already talked about archaic and archaic Adam, and we've talked about tribal in terms of tribal Abraham. So, what I'm going to do now is I'm going to pull up and share my screen to start a session today where I'm going to have a number of slides, if you will, a number of things that I want to go over, and I felt like I couldn't just do it verbally. So, I will put back up where we started last time, and that's our spiral map. And there it is, as you can see it. There's our spiral map. And I'm going to take it and I'm going to go from there. Before I get into these additional slides, I do want to make a few comments. And that's what we've covered so far. Adam and Eve, you start there in the genesis of the story. It's not the first century. Christianity's genesis is told by one seamless narrative. And that narrative begins appropriately with a writing called Genesis. In that story, Adam is eventually exiled from the garden. Separation from God then is identified as death, meaning when it was said, "In the day you eat of the fruit, you will surely die." Separation versus unity are the threads that go through the narrative until their conclusion in the first century time of transformation, when separation is ended and therefore death is defeated. Now, remember, our proposal is that the biblical narrative is not a story whose outcome is two world religions. Rather, we're proposing it is the story of the evolution of spiritual consciousness with regard to universal God identity. So we're looking at threads now. They're going to carry themselves all the way through. It'll get into the first century, which we'll look at on the spiral, bring us up to date today, where we can have a clear understanding of how in the world we ended up with division, a Christ divided rather than a Christ of unity. Another thread is the concept of the individual and the collective, and that starts in the beginning of the story. You have the individual Adam, and then when you get into tribal Abraham represents the collective, as in the 12 tribes. That continues on to the Christology of the first century. And one of the roles and functions of Christology will be to integrate those two, the integration of the individual and the collective. This is critical to understanding Christology because the Christological individual is Jesus of Nazareth. But Christology also includes the Christological collective, otherwise known as the body. If I jumped ahead and went way out to John's Revelation, he talks about the marriage of the Lamb and the bride, meaning the Lamb individual and the bride collective. And that marriage of the Lamb and bride comes along with the emergence of a new heaven and earth, meaning a new paradigm of thinking. The individual and the collective become one in their role and function and in their purpose. And we could also note that the function of male and female still represents diversity, but their identity transcends that diversity and reveals the true nature of each male and female to be the same, meaning that in this new paradigm, there is neither male nor female with regard to identity. Identity transcends that. And what we're saying is that identity comes from God and God alone as source. But the thread that is at the heart of this story relates to the identity crisis surrounding self as source versus spirit as source. Now, the self as source, as we've already discussed, is symbolized in the very beginning of the story by Adam. However, spirit as source begins with the story of Abraham. So we have self as source and spirit of source symbolized in the very genesis of the story by Adam and Abraham. Both appear then because the narrative is going to unfold the process by which universal God identity was revealed, even though we're going to see as we get into this world religion, Christianity, there have been numerous problems from the very beginning with that understanding. In fact, those two identities are in conflict throughout the narrative, as we're going to see, and they're very much in conflict today. So, Adam is self as source, but Abraham is a symbol of faith. So, faith is not self centered, self as source, meaning to find identity in the power of human doing. Rather, faith points outward and away from the self. It points to that which transcends the human, which in the biblical narrative is called God. That's the name for the transcendent. Again, the ultimate conflict between these two identities will be traced throughout all the way into the teachings of Jesus in the first century. We're going to look at Paul's mission to address the conflict between these two paradigms of thinking and how Christology is the determining factor of which of these represents the true identity of the human. Jesus will address that in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and the surprising, if not shocking, result will be discussed when I get to the movement from postmodernity into second tier integral and question how Christology has been interpreted since the days of the Holy Roman Empire. I'll get to the postmodern Christian eventually, not too far from here. Let's just remember for now that the promise to Abraham was a twofold promise. We've gone over this before, but I'm trying to outline the basic threads that you're going to find all the way through the narrative that are going to lead us to how the cartography of this world religion ended in this kind of result. The promise itself points to the concept of a trajectory. The people that write in integral theory and integral consciousness refer to this trajectory as the movement from ethnocentric to world centric. This is why the spiral model shows expansion. You can see on the spiral how as it goes up, it gets wider and wider. It's because it's becoming more inclusive of more different types and groups of humans as these worldviews that we see coming in stages and eras as they emerge. And this also introduces the element of complexity. As human population grew, the interaction between more and more humans increased, and that led to an increase in the complexity of life conditions. For example, the phrase today of global economy is far different than the trade routes of long ago between tribes and then eventually nations. But this same result is going to happen with Christianity. What became of identity was eventually, and to this day, revolved around who's saved and who is lost. The saved and the lost become two identities, Christian versus non Christian. Now, we will talk about postmodern Christianity and postmodern theology that's trying very much, and rightly so, to get away from the saved lost paradigm. But even in postmodernity, there are yet more steps ahead that can bring greater and greater unity. So, before I leave this, returning to Abraham, the faith of Abraham points to a world centric outcome of unity, not a tribal, denominated, separated result. And this story of Abraham also begins with an ethnocentric view or a one nation promise. The first promise to Abraham was, I will make of you a great nation. And again, just so I can review the biblical story in case you didn't see the movie, Abraham's son Isaac had a son named Jacob. Jacob had an experience of wrestling with an angel that was so real that he even got a broken rib from it. And so at that time, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, which means we who struggle with God. And Jacob, or Israel, then had 12 sons that became the 12 tribes of Israel, or the 12 tribes of Jacob. And that's Abraham's genealogical lineage that led to the first promise, I will make of you a great nation, singular. Now, as we talk about the threads, they're going to run through all of this. I think it would be good at this time to revisit some of the basic principles of those threads. And this is where I do have some slides here. And I'd like to move to the first one, which shows, first of all, this trajectory I've been talking about leading to universal God identity. You see in the two circles, you have two identities, after the flesh, after the spirit. After the flesh will be referred to as the human self as source of what becomes God identity. However, after the spirit is understanding our universal human identity as that which comes from and emerges from God or spirit alone as source. In the first paradigm of thinking, you end up with separation, and separation is defined as death. In the second paradigm, these are the principles leading to unity and life, not death. And when we talk about the concepts of form and formlessness, which we are not going to get into in great detail here, I did want to put it on our Venn just as a reminder for those of you who've watched and heard other podcasts I've done that form attachment or attachment to form for an identity would fit under this first after the flesh, self as source paradigm of thinking. Formlessness, on the other hand, would relate to an identity where God or spirit is the source of identity, and that would relate to the nature of their formlessness without boundary. How do you get from one to the other? You get from one to the other through the role and function of Christology, which we will be talking about at great length. Now, I want to talk about the idea of inheritance because that relates to Abraham and his sons, Isaac and Ishmael, which I'll make some comments about. Inheritance. Why would I bring up the concept of inheritance? Because what we're trying to determine is who are the true children of God. Well, look, this has been the argument within Christianity for centuries. Who's in, who's out, who's a true child of God, who is not really a true child of God. And not only do Christians argue about non Christians and whether they're really children of God, which the history of that is they obviously have not been. But even within Christianity, there are arguments between Protestants and Catholics. And then, even within that, There are arguments between those that are mainline versus those that are more fundamentalist and so forth. That's why inheritance is important, because inheritance in this story is a way or symbol that can help us understand who would represent, or what would represent, the true identity of the children of God. So, Romans 4:13 I've got up here is Paul saying this, for the promise that he would be heir, here's our inheritance, that he would be heir of the world. Now, this is heir of the world, not heir of a world religion. This is heir of the world, was not to Abraham or his seed through the law. We'll talk about the law and whether it will end up being something that is a self as source effort, or whether the law can be that which is and has a role and function, even if our identity is that which comes from spirit. Well, the world, this heir of the world, was not to Abraham through the law, but through the righteousness of faith. That is because faith points away from the self as the source of identity. And this righteousness of faith is, as Paul says in Romans 1:17, the righteousness of God. And the righteousness of God is being revealed from faith to faith. That's from the faith of Abraham to the faith of Christ. That's our trajectory. And that's why we are also saying to theologians today that we see the biblical narrative as one seamless story that results in the revelation of who are the children of God. And that's going to take on a world centric, integral, integrated, interconnected meaning, not a divided world religion. One last thing I want to bring up about the two sons. When Paul is describing Abraham's two sons in Galatians 4, he talks about Ishmael as being the son of the bondwoman, and the bondwoman also is a symbol for, at that time, bondage. And so you have the question of bondage. Bondage to what? Now we might say, well, it's obvious, bondage to sin. We were in bondage to sin and death. Okay. But what's behind that bondage? What we'll find is that when we meet that enemy, it will be ourselves. What I mean by that is what's behind that is self as source. That's the ultimate source of the bondage that results in the bondage of sin and death. For through self as source, sin entered the world through Adam. I want to visit that again and go back through what was the sin that came through Adam. I've talked about it in past podcasts, but we've got a lot of people that haven't been here for decades, if you will. So I do want to spread out the conversation to make sure that I cover all of the key notes. So Paul says the son of the bondwoman, Ishmael, will not be heir, here's the inheritance, with the son of the free woman, who is Isaac. His conclusion, so then, we are not children of the bondwoman, self as source, but of the free. Freedom. Freedom comes from that which is of spirit. Unity comes from that which is of spirit. So Paul will later talk about the unity of the spirit. But the tragic part, when you look back from our point of view, because we weren't raised all those centuries ago when the inheritance was lined out within their laws and their rules and requirements about inheritance work. The sad part is that inheritance was a principle that separated Ishmael and Isaac, when we will find out later that inheritance is completely transformed by Christology, and that when inheritance is transformed by Christology, Ishmael and Isaac are united in oneness. And this truly becomes a story of good news We're going to get more to that in just a little bit. Let's now look at a couple of verses I thought about that has to do with after the flesh, self as source, and the law. We're tying these things together. So you get the two paradigms and the elements that belong to each of those paradigms. So I thought about Philippians 3, and when Paul wrote to the people in Philippi, here's what he said: and be found in him, Christ, not having my own righteousness. So this is an identity, a righteousness of my own. Where's that come from? What's its source? Which is from the law. What does the law do? The law requires the human, through self as source, to obey the law. But to be found in the nature of Christology is not having a righteousness which is from human doing or the law or requirements from the law, but that which is through the faith of Christ, the righteousness which is from God by faith. This righteousness belongs to God and only God. And the faith of Christ was what? The faith of Christ was that of myself, he said, I can do nothing. And therefore, his crucifixion takes on the meaning of crucifying the self as source. He did not think equality with God was a thing to be grasped. Adam did. However, when Christ submitted to the crucifixion, he lay completely, through self as source, completely helpless in a tomb. And he was raised not by his own power, but by the power of the Spirit of God, as Paul wrote also in Romans chapter 1. Now, what about faith as a trajectory? Faith from promise to fulfillment, because we've been talking about faith as a trajectory. Faith as a trajectory. Well, Hebrews chapter 11, the writer lists all the great heroes of faith from Abraham to Christ. And here's how the writer confirmed the faith to faith. Remember Romans 1. Here's how the writer confirms the faith to faith trajectory. And all these past heroes of faith, starting with Abraham, Moses, going all the way up to the first century, having obtained a good testimony through faith, they all had faith in one way or another. They did not receive the promise, God having provided something better for us, that they without us should not be made perfect apart from us. Oh boy, there's some rich ideas in here. First of all, faith in and of itself wasn't that which was bringing about righteousness. Faith was pointing to the source that did bring about righteousness. It was not faith in and of itself. And this is why faith begins as a promise. Yes, they had faith, but that wasn't the end of the story. God, having provided something better for us, that was involved with the faith of Christ. What did the faith of Christ point to? It pointed to God as the source of life, of the source of identity. And the other statement that he makes is that they without us should not be made perfect apart from us, indicating everyone from the earliest times to the current times under Christology were being made perfect via the righteousness of God, where perfection can only exist. Which is again why Paul made the statement, there is none righteous, no, not one. And in our study of Romans 9 through 11, Paul emphasizes God has found all under disobedience that he may have mercy upon all. We'll talk more about that as well. And I want to say one more thing about Paul and his description of the meaning of Christology. In Romans 1, 3, and 4, here's what Paul said concerning his Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who was born according to the seed of David, according to the flesh. Ah, there it is, after the flesh. Jesus was born according to the flesh. That's not just biology, that's the whole paradigm of human self as source. He was born into that, but he was declared to be the Son of God with power according to the Spirit, according to the Spirit of holiness by his resurrection from the dead. And here, Jesus is the transformative foundation for the movement from after the flesh to the identity after the spirit. Those are the only two identities in the biblical narrative. And those identities are described as two sons, two women, two mountains, two covenants, two Jerusalems, very clearly delineated by Paul. So you can see how these threads are running all the way through the story. Now, why do I bring them up? Because they're going to have everything to do with the cartography that we find. A couple quick points about Ishmael and Isaac. It's obvious that the inheritance went to the firstborn, and Isaac was the firstborn of Sarah, who was married to Abraham. However, this principle of genealogy was also affected by the fact that Hagar was a handmaiden. Ishmael was older than Isaac, but Sarah was Abraham's wife, and on that basis, Sarah called for Ishmael to be removed from the household. Why? Because Ishmael was mocking or in some way persecuting Isaac, according to the story. And so Sarah, protective of her son, wanted to also protect her son's rights. And again, genealogy in the first paradigm becomes something that really symbolizes a lot of separation between two sons. Whereas when we consider the two types of identity and we think about Christology, the transform process was dying and rising. Dying to what? Rising to what? Both the Christological individual, Jesus of Nazareth, and the Christological collective or body were dying to all things that were part of the first paradigm. So here's the point: Jesus becomes the firstborn from the dead. The argument under genealogy was a biological argument. Who's in, who's out? Who's the firstborn? Who's not the firstborn? Jesus becomes the firstborn. That's an inheritance word. He becomes the firstborn from the dead. The body or collective represented the firstborn ones from the dead. This is determining inheritance beyond genealogy. The result of their transformative work, the result of Christology, led to the resurrection of the dead, meaning all in Adam, all. They were all being transformed. The creation was being transformed. And that meant in their day, Jew and Gentile, the entire creation. Further, this first century generation was a once and for all transformative movement. This Christological movement ushered in a new heaven and earth where there was one and only one identity, and that identity is after the Spirit. Once the new paradigm emerged as a new heaven and earth or a new Jerusalem, the process of rebirth was complete. The radical result we're proposing is that there is no more any need, dare I say it, for being born again. Try saying that in a fundamentalist church service. What I'm saying is that being born again was a first century movement from after the flesh, self as source, to after the spirit, God as source. And once that movement was complete, rebirthing had served its role and function. And there hasn't been born again we're proposing since that first century. Can people today say, uh, I've had this experience of being born again or rebirth or greatly changed? Yes. But in the biblical sense of Christology, no. That role and purpose was the two ages, the two worlds. It was cosmic. It involved the whole human family. Whatever your personal experience might be, I'm not denying that. I'm just saying when it comes to the inheritance and the biblical definitions, that's the topic of discussion. Now, if Jesus was the firstborn from the dead, he was modeling the necessity of being born again. And that means if Jesus had gone to the grave as just a great teacher, prophet, it would have led to the glorification of Jesus, of himself. But even though Jesus taught and did great things, it was necessary for the process of being born again to start with him. Every miracle he did, every parable he taught, pointed to the coming of a new world where God identity came through Spirit of Source. And the work of Jesus required that even he had to be born again, or he could not have been the firstborn from the dead. So, in that sense, we can see how the cross event changed everything. It transformed everything because it was the outward proof of the movement from self as source to spirit of source as source. Jesus crucified the self. He went to the cross as the ultimate act of faith. And faith, again, we're re-emphasizing these points so we can tell the story clearly. Faith is that which points away from the self. The saving faith of Christ is the foundation of Christology because it points to God and God alone as the source that gives life to the dead. It was God who gave life to the deadness of Sarah's womb. It was God who raised Jesus from the tomb. So, the Christological movement happened in the first century, just as Jesus prophesied. That was the meaning of being born again. So, I'm going to stop here for today because I want to go back even further to Adam and the self as source before I move on to in the spiral to look at law and so forth. And so I'm going to do that the next time that we get together, and the next time that I am uh, doing a podcast as I take down my slide now, and I am back with you. I had to maneuver that a little bit. But I'm looking forward to the next time that we get together and we have a discussion about these threads that are running all the way through and how they could possibly result in universal God identity. And that will involve the questions around good and evil. Anytime I propose this universal God identity, the questions about evil people always come up immediately as justification for why someone's specific denominated group represent the ones who are good and why they are in a position to judge the rest of the world as to who is evil. So I want to get to that the next time that I get together with you. So I'm going to end the recording right now, and I appreciate you joining me for this global discussion for a new Earth. Look forward to seeing you the next time.